I just woke up one night at 2 in the morning. I said, oh, I get it. There's no free will.
To what end? What do you think comes about teaching people that there's no free will?
We run our society on the notion that it's perfectly fine to treat some people way better than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, and other people way worse. And it never occurs to us that it's completely unearned. And that should shape what we're doing every single day.
Welcome back to The Everyday Stoic with myself, William Mulligan. Today's episode is powered by Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. I love Huel. Huel is delicious. It's very quick to set up. It's very practical when I'm busy on the go, if I'm writing, if I'm working out, if I'm in a hurry, if I'm looking after my daughter, I can hold her in one hand, set up the Huel with the other hand, and it's delicious food and it's healthy, more importantly. It saves me from going to the shops and buying junk, wasting loads of money. So if you have any interest in Huel products, click the link in the description. And my book, The Everyday Stoic Simple Rules for a Good Life, is now available for order. And thank you to everyone buying it, sharing it, and leaving reviews. It means a great deal. Enjoy today's talk. You said from the age of 14, you decided that there was no free will.
Yeah.
Okay, and how did that come about?
Oh, I was having a religion. I'm keeping my dog here calm.
Oh, hello. A boy or girl?
A boy, and very sweet. And very clingy. I was having like an obligatory existential crisis at 14. It was, in my case, sort of religion associated and very tied up with an issue related to free will and just what God's plans were all about. And it was all very, very distressing because it was mutually contradictory. And I just woke up one night at 2 in the morning and I said, oh, I get it. There's no God. And about 10 seconds later, I said, and there's no free will. And 10 more seconds. And the universe is this empty, indifferent, lifeless place that has no meaning. And it's been downhill or uphill since then.
Was you the type of kid that would be asking yourself the big questions?
Oh, yeah, I was bad enough at sports that I did that instead.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing you say that when someone said you had no friends, you said you had books.
Yeah, I was that type of kid, so I was even annoying then.
Something that I was very interested in, and when I've been bringing up this topic to a lot of people, they keep saying, to what end? And I guess they're trying to say, what do you think comes about teaching people that there's no free will?
I think it's one of the most academic problems out there. It is like relevant to every step in our lives, which is every single day we're judging someone, and we're judging them almost certainly incorrectly and not understanding how they became who they were. Every single day we feel a sense of entitlement about something, no doubt, and it never occurs to us that it's completely unearned. And that should shape what we're doing every single day. But it also should be shaping what we do with criminals and what we do with really smart people who would normally be getting bloated salaries, and what we do with everything. It's incredibly pertinent because we run our society on the notion that it's perfectly fine to treat some people way better than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, and other people way worse, and decide that justice is being done.
So do you think it creates a kind of all-round fairness if everyone understood this?
Yes, it would make, entitlement seem absurd. The notion that anyone earned anything, deserves anything, would be formally absurd. The notion that anything about your needs deserves more consideration than anyone else's makes no sense intellectually or ethically. And that's where it takes you. And given I've been taken there since I was 14 or so, I can't function that way most of the time. It's incredibly difficult. But, people need to try where it matters.
It's funny because I've been studying Stoicism, and, it's this philosophy, and it teaches us that most of the world is outside of our control. And the things that are in our control are just the way our opinions, our motivation, our desire and aversion. So it's this, like, in a way, it's a form of acceptance. Like, you accept the fate that's been handed to you. But I feel like you've took it to another level. And since I've been reading your book, I'll sit on a bus and kind of think, I don't know if I'm wrong here. It's like, I'm just sat there and going, I'm just watching a movie because this is just all happening.
This is all happening. The one thing where that diverges is sort of this knee-jerk reaction about rejecting free will, which is that it dumps you into fatalism. Oh, if everything is determined, nothing can change. That's incredibly not the case. Because of chaoticism, nonlinearity, blah, blah, all of that, in this moment, there really are multiple possible futures. And there are ones that could be affected by you. And when a particular future happens, you'll be able to see in retrospect where the determinism was. But the most important thing is what comes out of that is change occurs. Change, like, of kinds we would hope for can occur. And just the key thing to realize is we don't decide to change. We are changed by circumstance as a function of who we turned out to be going into that circumstance. So in that regard, I think there's the potential for a great deal of efficacy as long as you don't run away the notion of who is the author of it.
Well, just brings me on to my next question is, can you explain what it means turtles all the way down?
Yeah. Why did something just happen? Because of what happened just before. Why did that happen? Because of something just before that happened. This sort of causality, and God help us, we can get to quantum indeterminacy at some point. But absent that, everything is caused by preceding factors. And when it's trying to make sense of our behavior, the particular turtles that come in are ones what your brain just did a second ago, and what your environment caused your brain to do in the last minute, and what this morning's hormone levels did to your sensitivity to the environment, and all the way back to childhood and fetal life and genes and the culture your ancestors came up with. And in that regard, it's turtles all the way down. Don't ask me if it's turtles all the way to the Big Bang, because I somewhere before life evolved, I'm useless. But it's turtles all the way down to that regard, in that there were antecedent biological causes. And when you look at their nature closely, what you see is we are nothing other than those biological causes that we had no control over, and their interactions with environment that we had no control over. And when you see the workings of that, how the genetic effects from when you were like a fertilized egg influence what your brain did in response to trauma when you were 20 years old, which influences how you're responding to this person's face today. When you look at how all of those mesh, there's not a spot in there for a hypothetical turtle that's the last turtle going down, the turtle that's floating in the air, free of history.
Okay, yeah, because I remember you're saying it's kind of a private joke you had with your friends.
Yeah, it's like the notion where the whole point of that joke was, it was absurd. Oh, God, whatever William James says to her to challenge her view, she just doubles down and says it even more so. That's like totally absurd. That's great. What a great joke. And yeah, that's absurd. But given that image, it's far more absurd to speculate, to hypothesize that somewhere in there's a turtle that can float in the air that is free from anything before it. And that's what free will belief is.
Right. So we just spoke about you when you was 14. You had kind of a crisis, and you decided that there's no God, there's no free will. How did you decide to get involved in the work you're doing? I believe it started with primates.
Yeah. Let's see. Reflecting my sort of oddness as a child, I had already decided long before that I wanted to be a primatologist, go live out in the bush and study wild primates. And like that's where I was heading. I went to college to study with this guy who was one of the kings of primatology. And I had been writing in fan letters for years, all of that. So I was very set on that track. And during college, I stumbled into neuroscience as well and got like blown away by it. And the notion that, okay, you could think about how we became who we are from an evolutionary standpoint and an ecological standpoint, the primate stuff, or from the nuts and bolts neurobiology level. And, you know, all I've spent in the half century since then is trying to figure out, am I a neurobiologist? Am I a primatologist? And I've been like incredibly lucky getting to go back and forth for decades like that of being both, but both wind up just being two pieces of this larger story of 1 second before, 1 hour ago, all of that. And I think I sort of have wound up being such a jumping on the soapbox kind of pain in terms of there being no free will, in that I've been straddling two fairly different scientific fields all along. And as part of like my being a lab neurobiologist, where we stick genes into neurons and things like that, you're talking to molecular biologists and gene engineers and cell biology and, you know, that whole universe. And the primatology, increasingly over the years, who I was talking to were like psychiatrists and behavioral medicine types and public health people and like educators, child upbringing. So like between these two very different groups, you get to see, wow, it's the same exact conclusions. And this is how you get from this particular one to that particular one on this level. And here's where and I think just because I've been kind of carpetbagging in these two different fields, you get to see like it's the same punchline in a lot of different areas.
So like, I guess it was quite fortunate that do you feel like both of them kind of merged together and led to this, like this train of thought that you're on?
Yeah. And when you could somehow have it all make sense when you're talking to like a social worker type expert about why early poverty sets you up for lifelong behaviors of this or that, and see the evolutionary roots of that in non-human primates, and see exactly what that does to the brain on a molecular level, like beginning to imagine what these arcs are like. And there's just no room in there for this neuron just gotten in its head to do something from out of nowhere. It's antecedent causes all the way down.
So when you were studying baboons and you was actually observing them, was you having these thoughts right at the start, or did this kind of come later on?
Oh, just from the start, it seemed like it was another branch of what I was doing and trying to integrate them. Yeah. I wasn't just observing them. I was darting them with a blowgun, anesthetizing them, and doing a whole bunch of like basic medical workups on them using some of the same tests you would do in a human, looking at, you know, what does their rank have to do with how well their body works? What does their patterns of social affiliation? What does the culture of their particular troop, which is like a valid thing to ask. And then seeing stuff like, wow, when you look at a low-ranking baboon and you're figuring out the nuts and bolts of what's going on in their like pituitary and hypothalamus, it's the same nuts and bolts as someone who has clinical depression and someone who is at the lowest rungs of socioeconomic status. Like, oh, what's the common? They have been taught to be helpless from very early in life. And damn, their pituitary solves that problem in the same way, whether you were born into poverty or you're massively depressed or you're a low-ranking baboon getting dumped on. Something about the mechanistic similarities, just, it was all connecting.
I've been listening to a lot of podcasts of you, and I can see you've got a lot of passion for baboons.
Despite the fact that they suck. Rotten, foul animals. Like, I sure have loved certain baboons, but I do not love baboons or even like they're backstabbing bastards and all of that. So they're perfect for studying stress, but they're not the pathway towards non-human Zen.
Are there any primates that aren't backstabbers and horrible?
Well, I happen to have a deep, abiding love of mountain gorillas. That's what I imprinted on when I was about 8 or so at the Natural History Museum. Bonobos are pretty cool. You see primates that luck out and live in like dense rainforest. You don't have to have a territory. You don't have to defend it because the guy over there has a tree with as many leaves as yours has, and its leaves all the way for 1,000 miles kind of thing. So they wind up being much less aggressive. But the dirty secret then is they wind up being less interesting. I mean, what's cool about baboons is they're playing stupid, disinhibited chess all the time.
Oh, that's cool. Have you got any, I guess, favorite stories from your working with baboons?
Well, in terms of showing what they're like, you got 2 baboons, and I think this is in the book. You got 2 baboons that are chasing after, say, a gazelle.
Yeah.
And they're all set, they're going to nail it. And one of them is, I don't know if he cognitively is just like not smart enough to remember, why am I running very fast from this guy? Oh, I know, it must be because he's pissed at me and I better do something. Or if he just says we're running really fast and he's thinking about the gazelle and it's time for me to take advantage of it. But yeah, he spins around and they both go rolling and all of that. And that is shown by this extraordinary finding, which is you have a higher success rate at killing your prey if you hunt alone as a baboon than if you hunt in a pair, because the 2 of you are just going to get your issues in the way at some point or other. And they're just disinhibited. I was at, okay, here's a great example of sort of baboon backstabbing or just how they work. There's a very aggressive sort of triumphant call that males give when they've just won a fight. And it's, broadcasting and all of that. And it's very noticeable and everybody knows it. And everybody shifts their notion of who's on top appropriately. And this one time there was this alpha male who was just a total jerk. And I had just darted a baboon, another male who went down and was unconscious. And normally, rather than the danger at that point being baboons attack me because what have I done to their guy? And now I'm trying to pick him up and put him in the back of my Jeep. What's much more frequent is they decide this is a great time to kill the other guy because for some reason he's just lying there. What an opportune time. So it was one of those where you positioned yourself like crazy. So you know where everyone else is and the guy's likely to move this way if he's darted. So he's going to be over there in the bushes when he acts all stupid and hallucinating and falls over. But this guy picked up and crossed the stream bed, which takes about 10 minutes for me to drive down and find a plausible crossing and come back. And crap, he's just going to be lying there vulnerable like that. And then it got 10 times worse because the alpha male spotted that he had just gone down and he heads towards him. And I'm on the other side of this stream bed, and there's a buffalo down there, and I can't run around. And damn, he's going to kill this guy. It's my fault. And he comes up to him, and my guy is just lying there like that. And he puts one hand on his flank and one hand on his shoulder, and he gives that triumphant call. He was taking credit for my darting. That bastard was taking credit for it. I have no idea why he's out, but damn, I must have had something to do with Yahoo! Wahoo! He tells everyone, and satisfied, he then walks away, and I was able to like eventually get the guy perfectly fine. So that's how their world works in their heads.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing about baboons this way, because the way I thought is kind of they're working together for survival. So would they sort of sabotage their own group to get one up and be like, yeah, to get one up on the other person?
Yeah, this was sort of the original textbook heartwarming picture of like baboon savanna creatures, and they move in these formations where the males are on the outside and protect the females and the babies in the middle if a lion pops up, and they all are willing to sacrifice themselves for the group. And like this revolution in understanding evolution of behavior show animals do not behave for the good of the group. They don't behave for the good of the species. They behave for their own self-interest. So that one sort of collapses. And when you look at these baboons, the reason why they were perfect models for me to study stress in westernized humans is these guys weren't struggling every day for survival. They're like in a fabulous ecosystem. These big groups, the lions really don't mess with them much. Their infant mortality rate was lower than among the neighboring humans. And they only had to work about 3 hours a day to feed themselves, with this key implication that they got 9 hours of free time every day to be totally shitty to each other. All they do was spend all day generating social conflict and petty stuff and rubbing somebody's nose in their subordination. They're just like westernized humans. They're living well enough that they could devote their time to generating psychosocial stress. So they were perfect models for me to study. Primates where they're like struggling to get enough food and they're in the desert and are incredibly hostile, they would have been terrible models. They were perfect models for what I was interested in, because they're one of the few ones who have the luxury enough to invent stupid stuff in their heads and then make themselves sick over it.
Do you think you could make like a TV show out of the drama?
Oh, heartbreaking, like sort of scenes of Shakespearean betrayal and unrequited love and things. Yeah, they generate some pretty dramatic things at times. And when you sort of take into account that they're really, other than mothers and their kids, they're pretty selfish, awful guys there.
Yeah, I heard another funny story. Well, it wasn't funny, actually. It was a very interesting story, but it was something you said I found funny. So you was telling a story about a hyena, which I thought was an incredible story. And then you said it's one of your favorite stories about hyenas. The story was that there was a hyena in a hole.
Oh, yeah. That one, it was rainy season. The sides of this pit were slick. I don't know if he clearly slipped in or if he went in voluntarily to look for some stuff to eat and then couldn't get out, but he was stuck in there. As far as I can tell, he had been stuck in there for a few days. And like everyone's nightmare, if you work out there, the army ants had come. They are like they are so terrifying and so upsetting, and you just clear out of wherever you are and get a mile away from them before they like find you. And the army ants had found him because he couldn't get out of there. And they had eaten through his pelvic bone was showing. They had eaten through his skin there, and part of his muscle. They were eating him alive, which the army ants do. This was like so disgusting and disturbing, all that. So I went and got this sort of long log thing that I found and dragged it over, and I made kind of a ramp for him there. And it took him some tries, and he was sort of like psychotic with like everything going on at that point. But eventually he figured out how to climb up the ramp, which is not a normal thing that hyenas do. They're very much earthbound, but he managed to get out, and yay, I saved the hyena, and isn't that great? And then he chases me back to my car, where I had to like leap there into my Jeep for safety, which seemed very ungrateful of him. But then he went off limping with his pelvic bone sticking out. Like, oh my God, the stuff of nightmares that yeah, army ants, like it's so refreshing, the notion of being killed by a quadruped after you think about 100,000 ants eating you instead. Like that just seems like you just relish the opportunity for like some big old normal carnivore to take you out.
Yeah, because I thought it's funny because you said it was one of your favorite stories, and it just gave me the image of you being in loads of crazy situations like this. Is there any other situations from your work like that?
Oh, I don't know. This has to be. I spent 33 summers there.
Yeah.
And it has to be understood in the context that most of the time you're sitting there watching baboons sitting there, and hours go by, and it takes this incredible sort of patience of you're sitting there and you're watching somebody for a 20-minute sample, and like 16 minutes into it, he scratched his nose, and that was it. So like there was not fireworks very often, but a baboon who's darted and is just about to go down in the worst possible, most dangerous place you could imagine, up in front of a water hole that had a crock underneath, and he's gonna like teeter and fall in, and I gotta get to him. And this was my wife did 8 years of research with me as well, and the two of us and our Kenyan guy had to figure out how to get to him without. So that was very exciting. Or you dart some guy, and just as he's about to go down, he kills like a rabbit or something, which means everybody in the troop wants to get to him now. And he's sitting there with his rabbit, like ready to keel over. And like, you got to figure out what are you going to do to protect him, but he's going to be aggressive if you get close to him, even though he's hallucinating zebras, but because he's got the rabbit, and everybody else is going crazy trying to get to him, and you're going to seem like you're protecting. And like once every 3 years, one of those comes up, and you're like a wreck for days afterward, or you get a close call with some predator or something. But most of the time, just, look at those trees. Look at the baboon. He's still there.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like you've had some interesting times and lived quite I'd say, a very unique life. I think you're a unique person.
Well, I guess I was sort of, you meet people who do field work like that, and about 2/3 of them, they grew up out in someplace exotic. Their parents were researchers or missionaries or some such thing, and they just sort of fell into it. And then like 1/3 of us grew up in some god-awful urban like setting, and at some point stumbled into the Natural History Museum and just imprinted on that. And you're out there for like, because you turned out to be this like vast misanthrope rather than like you're inheriting the family business. So I was much more of that ilk. So I was extremely unprepared and had a very poor sense of like judgment and such when I went out there.
Just a quick word for today's sponsor, Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. I just want to quickly talk about Huel Daily Greens, because I'm loving Huel Daily Greens. I'm having them every morning. And what do I love about them? First of all, the healthy. I do like eating healthy foods. Just maybe placebo effect makes me feel really good about myself that I'm going in the right direction. But I also know my body's getting what it needs, which is good. And it's so easy to set up. You just put a scoop in, shake it up. I can do it with one hand, which is often the case when I'm carrying things or I'm carrying my daughter. I can do all these and just multitask. And then I've got a delicious daily green on the go. And I know it's healthy. And it's the same with the meals. Easy to make, tasty, delicious, nutritious. And if you have any interest in Huel products, click the link in the description. Let's enjoy the rest of the talk. Yes, there was an expectation on you to be a doctor, right?
Yeah, the usual. My son, the doctor. My father had started medical school during the Depression, and immigrant, no siblings, no relatives, single working mom, ran out of money and had to drop out and spent the rest of his life bitter that he never got to finish that. So like huge expectations tossed on me, the son, and yeah, and no, I wanted to go out and hang with mountain gorillas. It was only ironic that eventually this research sort of led me in the back way. I mean, I've joint appointments in neurology and neurosurgery, which, like, if only he could see. But yeah, I wanted no part of it then. I went out of my way in college not to take any of the prereqs for medical school. Yeah, this was not where I was heading. It was monkeys in the wild and rats in a lab.
So you was a bit of a rebel.
Yeah, quietly so. I I'm not confrontational. I run away and live in tents instead. So that was, but I just kind of turned out to be a disappointment to them, or a puzzle to them.
Yeah, I think more of a puzzle. I wouldn't say disappointment. So since reading Determined and listening to basically every video on you saying that we have no free will, there's a few. I do agree with you. Unfortunately, there's a part of my brain that's telling me not to agree with you. But there's a few slight, I guess, questions that I'd like just clearance on, better understanding. The first one is it the ACE score? ACA? Yeah. How can, some people get like a 10 on the ACE score, yet they go to live really successful, happy lives? What determines that?
Well, that one is 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 10,000. The predictability of a bad outcome instead is extraordinary. But what you're tapping into there is, along with, I just made a decision to do this with my hand. That felt so intentful and agentic that I just got to believe this free will. The other one is looking at these amazing exceptions. And wow, they pulled themselves out of there. And that's the other domain where I find people just have the strongest gut feeling that they're seeing free will in action there, that's how you get the 1 out of a gazillion who, with their ACE score of 10. What you have to see instead is, when you look more closely, is, that's what happened. That was the 3rd grade teacher who spotted some potential in them and mentored them, and they had never heard of the word college before that teacher taught it to them. That's the clergyman. That was what was the moment where there was a split in the road? What was they came within an inch of being shot when they were 8 and went home, and rather than saying, okay, I just have to be tougher and I'm going to be a great gang member, of saying, whoa, this is not right, or whatever. They stumbled on the right book that had pictures of, there's a world outside of my 5-block radius of hell. You look and there was a catalyst, because there had to have been a catalyst, because you can't independently invent yourself.
Okay, that makes sense. And another thing is, I remember seeing an article about an Indian ascetic who had a big iron grate around his neck. Well, he put it around his neck to show his devotion to the god. And the point was that he can override his biological needs to prove that he's more than just a biological animal that does these things. Can you explain that?
Yeah. How'd he become the sort of person who would be willing to do that? How did he become the sort of person whose values would include doing that? How did he luck out and not have like the most sensitive pain receptors in his neck that you ever find in humans? That he happened to have sort of a neurochemistry of pain that habituates quickly so that it becomes sort of dull throbbing instead of wanting to scream your head off? how'd that happen? Like, there's got to be some explanation for why someone becomes someone who so intensely wants to show they could transcend their biology. There's a biology and environment, and to people who are intent on doing that, he didn't come from nowhere.
Right, because I always had the belief that like the human drive is for reproduction. That's kind of like the reason we're here. Would you disagree or agree?
Well, sort of, again, getting back to evolutionary thinking, this massive revolution in the 1960s, organisms do not behave for the good of the species, for the good of the group, this very warm-hearted sort of group selection concept that dominated then. And instead, what swept in the 60s was a view organisms behave to maximize the number of copies of their genes they leave in the next generation. The selfish gene, individual selection, things of that sort, which says it's all about reproducing and leaving copies of your genes, until people began to figure out sort of the next step was sometimes if you want to leave lots of copies of your genes, instead of like reproducing, if you help close relatives leave copies of their genes, those are genes you share with them. If you help a brother reproduce twice, evolutionarily, in terms of the impact you leave, that's the same as you reproducing once. Like there was this British geneticist in the 30s, Haldane, who had this amazing quote, "I would gladly lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins," which is how the relatedness were. So suddenly it's not just your own genes. And then people figured out the biggest revolution of all, which is animals of all stripes, from like bacteria to us, do reciprocal cooperative stuff with each other when it is individually beneficial, and have been selected to do that, and have been selected to cheat whenever they can, and have been selected to be on guard against cheaters, and have all sorts of surveillance stuff with that. So like there's much broader strategies, all of that. But then you get to humans and all bets are off, because we're way too complicated to have our behavior predicted by modern. Yeah, we maximize our reproductive success. And then you get like crazy religious sects who are celibate and die out over time. Or, ooh, you behave for the good of your relatives as a function of how related they are to you. And then you see people who adopt children from the other side of the planet and would die for them and pour every resource into them. And in all those cases, you see, versions that greatly, defy the formal evolutionary logic, and the logic of cooperation being, cooperation evolves in a circumstance where if you are altruistic to somebody, you are doing so with a high expectation that they're going to do it back. Parentheses, you got to be a long-lived species. You got to live in a social group. You got to be smart enough that like you could recognize who did that, and all sorts of reciprocity stuff. And then like you are at an airport leaving a country you're never going to go back to again, and you're walking in the terminal and you stop and you hold the door open for someone. You are never going to see that person again. It is impossible that there's going to be reciprocity. Nobody else is there, so they can't see you, and you get reputational advantage. And we do that, and then we have no kids, and then we adopt kids from the others. All of those, by the time you get to primates, non-human primates, they're too smart for all the formal models of the evolution of behavior to predict what they have personalities, they have idiosyncrasies, they make mistakes, they whatever. And by the time you get to us, beyond the very, very broad trends, people tend to go to war against people who share very few genes with them, and tend to align themselves with people who share a lot of genes with each other. Beyond like broad stuff like that, humans are too smart for that. But then you see something like in Britain, you can be in the military, and the person you're willing to give up your life for, their great-grandparent was from India or Jamaica, or And now who counts as an us is not based on like relatedness anymore, but cultural relatedness. And so even all bets are off on that one when you look closely. I mean, people did studies showing in World War II, there were circumstances where the average degree of relatedness between a Nazi soldier and a German American soldier was greater than that German American soldier and the Italian guy next to him and the black guy next to him on this side. And yet these are the people he's willing to give up his life for. Oh my God, that makes no sense to a giraffe or something. It gets more complicated with humans.
Right. I guess that sort of answers it, but it opens up a lot more questions about humans for me, which I won't get into. So with your book, not just your book, this idea you're proposing or this belief you have, what would a world look like where everyone understands this? I guess that is the world you would like.
Oh God, well, it's completely unimaginable. One in which you don't blame someone or punish them, and nonetheless you find ways to keep society safe from dangerous individuals. You don't praise or reward anyone, and nonetheless you keep society filled with people who you've motivated to do the hard work to become good surgeons and good accountants and all of that without having to inculcate them into thinking that they have a better soul than everyone else. People are selfless. Hatred disappears because hating someone, even if that someone is a Putin or a Trump or any of these folks, it's like hating an earthquake. You really, it's just totally crazy and difficult. And what I keep coming back to is, this is a completely revolutionary upheaval of society that needs to take place, but it's going to have to do one baby step at a time, because we've been doing it one baby step at a time for centuries of realizing, this is a domain where there's no free will. And we learn how to run society, having subtracted that out and becoming more humane in the process. We figured out witches don't cause bad weather storms. We figured out the kid sitting next to you in the classroom is having trouble learning to read, not because they're lazy, but they have a brain malformation thing that's called dyslexia. And like when I was a kid, I'm old enough that the kid sitting next to me at school who wasn't learning how to read, they're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're not very smart. And all of us and the teacher, those were the attributions. And we now know, they had nothing to do with it. They just they reverse looped letters or something because of something screwy with their cortical architecture, which we even understand something about. And like in an enlightened world where education is about education rather than like, how do we make sure the kids aren't bringing guns into school? Everybody recognizes by now this is like blame, stupid, lazy kid has been subtracted out of the picture. And that's fantastic. And you get like all these people, adults who are saying, God, I wish I had gotten my dyslexia diagnosis when I was 10 instead of last year. I spent my whole life hating myself for being stupid and unmotivated and what's wrong with me. And it's like, great. So, we're not going to have a world overnight where there's no criminal justice system and you just quarantine dangerous people and there's no meritocracy anymore, but somehow you still motivate people to want to work their asses off to become very skillful, but nobody is going to tell them they're a good boy for having done so. They're just going to say, whoa, society is so grateful that you turned out to be the sort of person who could be trained to be an amazing agronomist or who knows what. Yeah, none of that is happening soon, but we do it piecemeal, a few steps at a time. And sometimes it's not just this gradual process. I'm not sure what the speed was in the UK, but in the United States, like around 1990 or so, over the course of about 10 years, we went from 12% of Americans supporting gay marriage to 60%. And that's going to be like a fascinating piece of history to figure that out. And it's not going to be because of science or any policy. It's because of the right celebrities turned out to be like beloved by everyone. And oh my God, they turned out to be gay and they've got a same-sex partner and all that. And you see pictures of them going to the Oscars and they're like hand in hand with it. And whoa, that's like some of these like happen in a decade or so. That might be happening with trans individuals now. We'll have to see how complete that is, but at least in the US, the forces of darkness are fighting against it like crazy. But, for the most part, it's going to be a very slow process. Every now and then you luck out and you get a gay marriage example, but you got to push. And probably the most important thing is to raise kids where rather than the most important thing you pound into their heads is everybody needs to take responsibility for their actions, including you, is to raise them so they look at somebody and their first thought is, how did they become who they are? And how was that because of reasons I know nothing about? Before you make a judgment about them, they came from a very different, and remember your privileges and don't run with them. Remember that you lucked out and that didn't happen to you. And like if you raise kids that way, where their first thought every time they're angry about something is, well, how did that person become that way in ways that I can't imagine, but ways that I have to at least consider as a possibility? Or I've just done something amazing and how did I come to be? Yeah, my parents were stable. They gave me lessons and whatever. It's, bottom up generational thing, except for every now and then when the lightning strikes, like the gay marriage version.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like it would create a lot more understanding and empathy, especially if someone was raised that way. The only thing I'm thinking is, what's to stop people from using that as an excuse for their poor behavior?
Of course. The cynical, like soundbite responses, we have a world in which we raise people with a belief in responsibility and efficacy and free will and all of that. And we've got a pretty crappy track record at people never giving excuses for their behavior and all of that. So the starting point as to what the alternative is not very impressive. If you really, really raise kids, you raise them to do difficult things. And if you raise it in a framework of you were not admitting to being a rotten human, you're admitting that you're the one who did that. And here's why that's not okay. And here's the impact and all of that. Yeah, stupid, ridiculous, utopian. I can't believe like this guy here going on like that. But we do it in some realms and we slowly get better at it. And the danger that people will run amok because they can't be held responsible is a red herring. That won't just, like as I did at great length and have had great personal motivation to do so, there's a huge literature that's dissected why atheists are exactly as ethical as the most ethical theists out there. And it's the same story with people who won't believe in free will. So I'm not that worried about that one.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just reminded of, I don't know if you've seen it, Ricky Gervais he has a comedy, and someone says the same thing to him, well, if you're an atheist, why don't you just go around killing people? And he's like, because I don't want to.
Yeah. And if you're not doing that to me simply because somebody is going to boil you in hell for eternity, like you don't have a whole lot of bragging rights either. Yeah. You just have to get people to do the hard work of thinking through what all of this is for and what your responsibility is to your fellow human and where's meaning coming from. And if you come out the other end deciding there's no God, or deciding there is a highly gossip-prone, interested God there, or there's no free will, or we are the masters of our... If you've done like the hard work to think through it, that's pretty much you're going to turn out okay, regardless of which one of those you wind up with.
Yeah. But just going back to like me reading your book, the more I try to, because I've been trying to prove you wrong, just in my own head. I've been like debating myself. And the more I try it, the more I realize I can't, I have no way of proving you wrong. And like, the more I think about it, the more I side of you. And people who I've been speaking to about this have been starting to agree as well. At the start, they'll go, that's ridiculous, which I said.
Yet there would be a way to prove me wrong. And this is where, like, I could scream every time someone says, prove there's no free will, prove there aren't invisible whatever's floating around in the air, prove whatever. By now, the onus is on people who believe in free will to prove, to show a mechanism by which behavior happens that's completely free of biological environmental history. If you can show, like, a brain that is truly an uncaused cause, it wouldn't matter if you change the genes, if you change its fetal life, et cetera, blah, blah. Show me a behavior that has occurred completely free of history, and you'll have just proved to me there's free will. And nobody can, because there's no known mechanism by which a neuron or a bunch of neurons can just decide to do something that has not been shaped by what came before.
Okay, so just before I was speaking to you, someone was debating me, a guy from work. He was trying to say you're wrong. And I don't know if this makes sense, but he was saying, imagine a human's been put in a maze, and they get put in a maze, and then they take a certain route to go out. If they take a wrong exit, they die. And the idea is, if the human gets put in the same maze again, from the same starting point, they would take the same route every time. So all the circumstances are exactly the same. It's the same, like, it's like they've gone back in time to that exact starting point.
Well, they would be exactly in the same place at that starting point then, but because of chaoticism, butterfly effects could come up that could completely change the outcome. But everything else being equal, which it never is, the same thing should happen again. But it's not going to, because all things are never equal. The minutia of chaotic effects that turn out not to be minute means that there are multiple possible futures, even if every single atom is in the exact same place. In that regard, that guy Laplace was wrong. You can't predict the future, because built into it is formal unpredictability. And then that huge challenge that unpredictable is not the same thing as undetermined and all of that. So no, it won't be the same.
Okay. So that kind of, my next point would have been, if, I guess there's no point carrying on, but if he would have kept taking the same route, then one day he decided to take another route, would that have been free will? That he's on the spot gone, actually, I'm going to go right this time.
Where'd that come from? What has he been mulling over at night when falling asleep? Has he come up with some religion where he believes that if he believes enough, a door, a portal is going to open at the end of that corridor where 4,000 people have gone and starved to death instead? Does he believe that, that a construction crew came in last night, there was an overthrow of the faceless people running this maze, and a new regime came in and put a door in there since last night, and it's time to check that out? How did he wind up having a certain sort of optimism? How did he wind up having a certain sort of gullibility? How did he, any of that?
Okay. I don't know if this is even something you can answer, but what would free will look like?
I really don't know what it would look like, because I don't see any mechanisms by which something in your brain does something independent of the 80 billion other neurons that it's connected to and what their childhoods were like and all of that. It's mean, I think I go over which chapter, I don't know, somewhere in there, the quantum mechanics chapter, that you get neurons will spontaneously dump neurotransmitters. Neurons will every now and then have a spontaneous action potential. And whoa, that's free of history. And then you see things like they evolved special pathways for doing that. They were shaped by their history to have moments where they're free of their history. They were, you have a capacity in these systems to determine this is a good time to be undetermined, but that's not free will. That's you're taking an improv class and the instructor says, okay, you're the boss. You're the person who's late for getting here. Go improvise a scene. That's not free will. That's, determinism within constraints as to where the undetermined actions are okay and acceptable. No matter how cool of an improv class it is, you can't stab the person to death at that point. That's not a free will option that you have. So even your history determines circumstances where let's have a little indeterminism. There are genes that have evolved to make your brain free of genetic influences, which seems like so impossible and oxymoronic, but those are genes that determine that you're more sensitive than average to environmental cues. Parentheses, less constrained thus by other genetic cues. So those, I can't imagine the cases where you seem to see a nervous system doing something all on its own from out of nowhere. It's because circumstances decided that's a good time for that, and that sure is not freedom.
Okay. So how has this understanding affected your life?
I'm a person of my time and place, and my first reflex and my 10th reflex is often to function with judgment and often to decide I'm pleased with praise and somehow earned it and all of those things. And, all I have to do is have a very, very strong sense of anytime you decide you understand what's going on, assume you don't and think about it a second time and a 10th and a 20th time. And every now and then I can do that. Every now and then, if I've had a lot of rest or whoever's angered me has not really hit all sorts of alarms in my head as to why I hate that sort of person. And it's hard, but I've gotten better at it. I had judgments about people with reading problems when I was a kid, and that continued into early adulthood before I learned enough about dyslexia that I don't have that response anymore. I don't have certain responses to certain people who do awful things because I've learned sort of where that comes from. So, it's a very, very slow-moving revolution, and I don't do it anywhere near enough as should be the case. And yeah, because this isn't easy, and it isn't going to be easy for anyone, but we can do it.
Okay, so what is your personal life philosophy?
Do I have one? God help me saying anything about Buddhism, because not only am I the most unspiritual person on earth, I'm a materialist in a very mechanistic sort of way. But I know nothing about Buddhism other than they seemed very cool at various points when I was a teenager. But this concept of theirs, unselfing, seems like a pretty good goal. You have earned nothing that you have. It's just been by luck. No one else has earned. All you are is the sum of. It's like a spiritual equivalent of where all this neurobiology has led me. That's a good goal. I try for it.
Okay.
I'm usually not successful.
And then last question is, if you're talking to your younger self, maybe 14-year-old you, what would you say to that self to help them through life?
Don't be as ambitious as you are, especially to my university self, my early adult scientist self. Don't be as ambitious, because it's going to be hard to remember what you're giving up in the process, and try to put that in perspective, and put in perspective how much of your ambition might be driven by the people you were furious at from back when, that somehow this counts as you showing them they were wrong, or they were mean, or they were what. Yeah, I don't know. I'm from a world of frantic, obsessive overachievers. And, the students I see are just like, their version of insane ambition is they want to become the next Bill Gates, just because, this is the tech universe here in Silicon Valley that I'm in. But it's the same sort of punchline, be less ambitious and go figure out how many things you're saying no to implicitly every time you say yes to something difficult and demanding, and really think it through.
I think that's really good advice, actually. I think that's good advice for me.
For me as well. I still don't listen to it very effectively, but I hope it's good that if that would be helpful to you.
There's a difference between feeling better and actually getting better. Sometimes we have to endure tolerate discomfort in order to get better longer term. But we are constantly duped by going for the easy option. The most ingrained, fundamental, primitive, and world's most popular coping strategy is avoidance.
I kind of feel like I'm guilty of a lot of what you've been saying. What should I do instead?